Well, thank you very much, and it's great to be here, and apologies to everyone who's standing up the back. I know that it's not very comfortable. I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes or so and then allow time for questions, because I think dialogue is always more interesting than monologue. But I always feel when I talk to audiences of predominantly young people that I need to start with an apology. And that's an apology from my generation, I'm 49, to your generation. We've made a right mess of things. That's the state of the world that we're giving you. But what we can do and what we need to do is all of our generations need to get together to fix it. And of course, Global Fossil Fuel Divestment Day is a great day to be doing that, and it's really great to hear about the progress that you're making here at LSE. I actually made a little video this morning that also mentioned the campaigns at UCL and SOAS on that. And you might know that Glasgow University has recently gone for the divestment program. Oxford City Council, led by the Greens, has done that. So we're making real progress. Just to begin, a little bit of me, so you don't sit there wondering. The accent originally comes from Australia, although I haven't lived there for 20 years, so don't ask me detailed cultural questions anymore. And my first degree was agricultural science. And when you put those two things together, not only does it mean that I'm quite unusual in politics in having a science background, it also means, and this is something the British media has been most interested in about me, that I'm probably the only British political leader who knows how to shear a sheep. Which probably tells you more about the British media than it does about me, actually. But I started off with the apology, and the apology is for the three crises that we're facing today in the world. We're facing an economic crisis, a social crisis, and an environmental crisis. And that economic crisis, I can go to that well-known radical organisation, the International Bank for Settlements, which a couple of months ago said, we're closer to a financial crash now than we were in 2007. Would you believe in 2015, we're still talking very seriously about, we've got to do something about this problem of the too big to fail banks. We have a profoundly unstable financial system that threatens all of our economic futures. And then we've got the social crisis. And the obvious place to start with this is food banks. In Britain, the world's sixth richest economy, last year 1 million people relied on charity, were left simply unable to put food on the table unless someone gave it to them as charity. And that links to another figure, which is the fact that 1 in 5 workers is on less than a living wage. People can be working full time, but they're actually not paid enough money to live on to meet their even most basic needs. And if you think about how that living wage is calculated, and it's $9.15 an hour in London, and you might know that the minimum wage is $6.50 an hour, that's calculated on the basis that, you put food on the table, you pay your rent, and you get 1 week's domestic holiday in Britain a year. So we're not talking about luxury here or anything like that. And then we've got the environmental crisis. And I kind of doubt standing in front of this that I need to talk about climate change. But I think it's really important to say that the environment doesn't stop and end with climate change, as incredibly pressing and important as that is. There's one figure that I think really sums it up quite well, what we're doing to the natural world, what we're doing to biodiversity. And that comes from the World Wildlife Fund a couple of months ago. And they estimate that we have lost, in the past 40 years, in my lifetime, 50% of the world's vertebrate wildlife. There are half the number of wild animals in the world now that there were 40 years ago. And when you think about that figure, you're probably thinking, exotic things far away like tigers and whales and those sorts of things. But if you actually think about the British countryside and what we've done with industrial agriculture to the British countryside, hedgehogs, those lovely, I was going to say cuddly, but that's not quite the right word. Lovely, iconic, attractive, everyone would like to have them in the back garden if you've got a back garden species. And over the past decade, hedgehog numbers have gone down 38% year on year, every year. An exponential collapse. Hedgehog numbers are falling off a cliff. And if you go out and drive into the British countryside, you will now almost never see a hedgehog squashed on the road. And that counterintuitively is a really bad thing, because it means there's no hedgehogs there. And that is a symbol of the kind of things we're doing. And if you look at the oceans that we're turning into a plastic soup, you look at the soils that we're destroying at great speed. And I can get really geeky about soils, but don't worry, I'm not going to. It's a Friday night, so I won't do that to you. So there's all of that. And then, of course, we've got the fourth crisis, which is the political crisis. The fact that people have looked at the three, now anyway, largest parties with representation in Parliament, looked at what they're saying and said, well, that's no kind of answer, is it? So that's where we are. And the good news is that I'm now going to stop being depressing. I've done the pessimistic bit, and I'm now going to do the optimistic bit. Because it's very clear that the status quo cannot survive. We are not going to stay where we are now. We have to have real change. And that change is starting, perhaps, in our politics. Because what we've seen over the past 3.5 decades or so is the dominance of what you might call neoliberalism, neo-Thatcherism, neo-Reaganism, a kind of philosophy that, to sum up, has said that greed is good and the planet is somehow infinite and we can just keep trashing it. And yet more and more it's clearer and clearer to people that that ideology is bankrupt even in its own terms. And I think if you look at, people get this on different kind of levels, but if you actually look at the surveys when you ask people, do you think your children and grandchildren will have a better life than you've had? Increasingly people say no. They get that the system is broken and it needs to change. And so what I'm going to do next is offer you a few suggestions about how in the Green Party we think we need to change the system, change it fundamentally, change it first of all in some fairly basic things and then some really big things. So to start off with, we're saying we have to end the program of austerity. Austerity actually means making the poor, the disadvantaged, and particularly you, the young, pay for the errors and fraud of the bankers. You had no part in the bank crisis, yet you're all in various ways paying for it, as are particularly disabled people in Britain and single parents in Britain. And how do we do that? Well, in short, what we do is we make multinational companies pay their fair share of taxes and pay their workers fairly, and we make rich individuals pay their fair share back into the society that's made them rich one way or another. Now, it's one of those things that's easy to say, and the obvious question is, how are you going to do that? And it's not simple, but let's think of a certain coffee company that serves what I consider really lousy tasting coffee and doesn't pay very much tax except donates a bit now. You know the one I mean. What we had, Caroline Lucas, the Green MP, had a private members bill in 2011, the Tax and Financial Transparency Bill. And one of the things that demands is that if you want to do business in Britain, you have to have country-by-country reporting. So you have to say every other country in the world where you operate, how many staff you've got there, what your turnover is and what your profit is there. So if it should turn out that 50% of your massive global profits are made in a tax haven where you've got 2 men and an office dog employed, it's clear what's going on. And I think it's probably worth exploring a bit more about thinking about just how parasitical and damaging these kind of companies are. And I'll pick the one that I'll pretty well guarantee everyone in this room has, at Christmas or since, either bought or had bought for them something from it. The website Amazon. You've got to work pretty hard to stay away from it. Amazon last year paid 0.01% of its turnover in tax. It effectively paid no tax at all. But you think about the road running down there. There will today have been lorries carrying Amazon parcels running down that road. And all of us with our taxes are paying to maintain that road. But Amazon isn't. It's a parasite. It's sucking profits out and not putting its fair share back. So that's what we've got to do. Instead of austerity, have multinational companies and rich individuals paying their way. And on the other side of things, we need to make sure that work pays. Now, you might actually recollect, if you've got a long memory, that this government came in promising to make work pay. Instead, what they've made work do is pay a lot less, because real wages have tumbled. And there's a simple statement really, and I've knocked on some doors of some houses people who are clearly Tory voters, and said to them, if someone works full time, they should earn enough money to live on. And they say to me, well, yeah, that's a reasonable statement. And that's why in the Green Party we're calling immediately for the minimum wage to be made a living wage, and a minimum wage of £10 an hour by 2020. And what that means is that minimum wage, living wage, then 4% increase year on year through the term of the next parliament. And what that means, and something that's really important to so many people, is it offers a sense of security, stability, a kind of future that you can rely on. And then we come to the issue of benefits. And there's been a huge amount of stigmatisation, a huge amount of hideous language, the kind of language that's otherwise only been applied to immigrants, about benefit recipients. But what I would say is, if we aspire to be, which I think we do, to be a decent, humane society, we should be giving benefits to everybody who needs them. And not giving them grudgingly, not giving them so that people feel like it's a charity and they're almost begging, but gladly, saying we're a decent society, we don't want anyone going hungry, worrying about losing their house. So that's the kind of gradual change stuff. The other thing that I'll briefly mention, and I'll talk about it more if you like me to, is what's known as universal basic income or citizens' income. And this is a longer term idea that eventually offers people a real sense of security and safety. It's an idea that if you're accepted as a member of this society, and I used to years ago talk about citizens' income, but in the age of UKIP, I've kind of gone to universal basic income, for reasons you can imagine. You're accepted as a member of this society, you get a basic payment every week. That means you don't have to worry about the basics, putting food on the table, keeping a roof over your head. And what that means is it really terrifies conventional economists, because it's really hard to model how people will behave. But there's a couple of very obvious things. One, it immediately removes benefit traps. If you get this payment every week, no matter what your income, say you're a full-time carer, you mostly spend time caring for a relative, but some friends come to visit and they're doing the caring for a month, you've got a chance to do some work. You can do that without risking all of your benefits falling off a cliff, taking 6 weeks to restore, and you end up the payday lender before you know it. Removes the benefit traps and gives people the option of what they do with their lives. If you want to start a small business, at the moment you can be taking an enormous risk to go out on your own. You won't get job seekers allowance anymore, you're trying to get this small business up and running, but you've got no security behind you. And this gives you the security to start that small business. And one of the things you might find is that really lousy jobs, it might be hard to get people to do them. I did once say sewer cleaners, and of course there was someone in the audience who said their mate was a sewer cleaner and he really liked his job. But let's think about those really horrible call centres that we've all heard about and sometimes had contact with. The kind of call centres where every call has to be finished in 58 seconds and they time you when you go to the loo. It might be quite hard to get people to go and work in those sort of circumstances, and it might be a very good thing. So that's universal basic income. Thinking a bit more, and since particularly we're in Green Week, I need to talk a little perhaps about energy policy. And where we need to start with energy policy is the point where the others kind of finish off if they remember it and don't forget it at the end of the sentence. And that's energy conservation. The fact is we waste vast amounts of energy. We have some of the poorest quality of housing stock in Western Europe. £1 in 4 we spend on heating our homes goes straight out through a drafty door or window or up through an uninsulated ceiling. And we desperately need to change that. And that's how we can cut our energy bills, create jobs, and cut carbon emissions. And there's a proposal of how to do this. It's called the Energy Bill Revolution. And for those who want to go away and look at all the maths of this, it's all been worked out by charities, NGOs like Help the Aged, and the unions. And what this does is sets out a way of how we basically fix Britain's housing stock. And I actually had a very interesting lunch recently with some ambassadors from Baltic and Scandinavian countries. And I was talking about this. And one of them said to me, "Yeah, your buildings are just so cold." And this is someone who comes from a country that's sort of, on average about 20 degrees, certainly in winter colder than we are here. We just don't realise how bad our buildings are. And the really interesting thing about that is it demonstrates one of the key principles that we really need to see the shift happening, which is that it's not a case of, we've often been told in the past, oh, well, we can't really do environmental stuff because we've got to fix the economy. But this isn't an either or. What we have to do is change the whole model of the way our economy works so that it works for the common good within our environmental limits. So there's just a couple more topics I want to briefly address before we get to the question stage. And one of them is education. And I kind of suspect it won't be a surprise to anyone in this room to know that the Green Party believes in zero university tuition fees. Kind of figure that's pretty well known. But it's worth saying why we believe that and why we've believed that through the decades, which is we believe that education is a public good. It's good for everybody, every bit of extra education any individual in society gets, whether that's an NVQ or a PhD, and that should be funded through general progressive taxation, not leaving many of you going through potentially the next 30 years of your life with that weight of debt on your shoulder. Because one of the things, and I share a lot of platforms like this with a lot of different politicians, and it's usually a Lib Dem who says, it's all right, most people will never pay it back. And they're right about the fact, of course. The latest figures suggest that 75% of students will never pay that fee back. But what's terribly wrong about that is the fact that many students will be going through life, any year you earn any kind of money at all, you'll be paying back 9% of your income to a debt that you're never going to pay off. And those are, for most of you, the years when you might be thinking about settling down, maybe buying a house, starting a family. And there's that weight of debt sitting on your shoulder. And that's just not right. And it's going to have huge economic impacts that I think really haven't been thought through properly. Just while I'm on education, very briefly, we've got a whole set of policies on education that pretty well square with most of what the NUT, the UCU and lots of the other education unions are saying. And one of the keys in this is that we have to stop our schools being exam factories that ram pupils through exam after exam after exam, in which teachers are forced more and more narrowly to teach to the test. And that means a much broader education, an education that prepares you for life. Caroline Lucas, the Green MP, has got a bill a private member's bill that might even, it's getting a lot of support, might sneak through to make PSHE education, things like sex and relationship education, financial education, education about nutrition and food, make that a statutory provision that all schools have to provide. And that's something that schools should do, help people prepare for life. And what we need to do is have cultural education, music education, arts education, really valued and supported. Because one of the things that we got really narrowly with this government is they keep saying, right, this is for the economy. But a huge part of our economy in Britain is cultural. And they're giving everyone a chance to have a go at those things, find out where their skills and talents lie, are really actually critically important. One other issue I'm going to mention before I close, which is housing. And I'm talking about right messes. Housing is really one of those extremely right messes. I know people who have got first and second graduate jobs in London who were struggling to be able to afford to rent a single room, let alone to be able to afford to rent their own house. It's utterly out of control, and we have to turn this around. And the kind of underlying philosophical change that we have to make is we have to stop regarding housing primarily as a financial asset and go back to regarding houses as homes. And there's a whole range of things that we need to do with that. But just to pick out a few of them, we want to end right to buy, which is simply the privatisation of public assets, which very often quickly end up in the hands of big landlords who then collect large amounts of housing benefit from the public coffers to subsidise their borrowings. We've got a plan to build 500,000 social rent homes, and that means genuinely affordable, probably a lot of them council, but genuinely affordable homes for rent. And I have to say genuinely in that sentence, because here in London we've got this new definition of affordable, which means 80% of market rent. So at Mount Pleasant, just up the road from here, there's a new development where to get an affordable rented house, a 4-bedroom flat, you'll need an income of £100,000 a year. Yeah, it's not really affordable. We also need to put rent caps on so that once you've rented a place, you can have security that the rent won't go up by more than about the rate of inflation each year. And of course, to enforce that, you're going to need security of tenure in that private rental. And what that will also do is stop what we're hearing more and more about revenge evictions, Shelter calls them. You're renting a place, you actually have what the landlord regards as a really unreasonable request that you want the boiler to work because you'd actually like some hot water. And the landlord chucks you out and puts in someone who's not going to complain if the boiler isn't working. And that's just not right, and a real sign of the kind of imbalance that we've got. So I've covered quite a bit of ground there, and as I said, I do prefer dialogue to monologue. But I'm just going to finish with a bit on politics, and Hugh has already said some of this. But I'm sure you've all, if not seen, certainly heard about the Russell Brand message. To paraphrase roughly, he said, or told Newsnight, "Don't vote, it only encourages them," or something like that. I agree with Russell Brand on a lot of things. I entirely disagree with him on that one. Because if you don't vote, what you're actually counted in the "I'm happy enough with how things are as I haven't bothered." That's what you're being counted as if you don't vote. So some of the right-wing papers got very exercised when I said this on national television. But first of all, make sure you register to vote and get all your friends and people you work with, encourage everyone to register to vote. And make sure you go to the polling station. Now, obviously, I'd encourage you to vote Green, but actually I'm going to give you a message that I think is even more important than that. I'd encourage you to vote for what you believe in. Look in whatever constituency you live in, look at the websites, go along to a hustings and hear the candidates if you can, research the party's policies. There's a great website called Vote for Policies, which at the moment is based on the 2010 general election manifestos, but there'll be a new one for 2015. And yes, I will admit some self-interest there, because currently the Green Party's running on 27% on that and winning. And I'll take that in May. But what I would urge you to do, because we've been trained by a first-past-the-post electoral system in Britain, over decades, generations have been trained, to vote very often for the personal party they dislike the second most, to stop the people they really hate getting in. And that's actually given us the kind of politics that we have now. It's given us the politics where the two largest parties, although they might sound a bit different, when you actually look at their policies, whether it's on fracking, whether it's on public ownership of the railways, whether it's on a whole range of issues, there's not much difference between them because they're all chasing the swing voters in the swing seats. And for you as voters, this election is really a chance, now we're in multi-party politics in Britain, it's a chance to actually deliver something different. If you vote for what you believe in, not just the Vote for Policies website, but all the evidence shows that we can make an utter peaceful political revolution in Britain in this election. Vote for what you believe in, but, and this is the bit the right-wing papers got very exercised about, do make sure you go and vote, and even if you find yourself on the ballot paper there's no one you think you want to vote for, my suggestion is write a rude word on the ballot paper. Because someone will see that, all of the odd ballot papers get scrutinised, and you won't be counted with the happy enough with how things are group. So obviously I'd like you to vote Green, obviously I'd like you to vote for what you believe in, but do make sure that you go along to the polling station or get a postal ballot and make sure that your voice is counted. And just finally to finish, it was mentioned that I'm standing in Holborn and St Pancras, which basically starts up about Holborn Tube. I describe this as a Green Labour marginal. It's just the margin's very large. But what I mean by that is that there's no risk of Lib Dem or Tory being elected. There is, last time the Lib Dems got 29% of the vote in this seat. There's a lot of people on doorsteps who've said to me, well, I voted Lib Dem in 2010, but I'm not going to make that mistake again. And there's also a lot of people who say to me on the doorsteps, well, I voted Frank for decades, and that's Frank Dobson, who's been the MP for more than 3 decades, and he's not standing again. So this is a real chance for a fresh start in Holborn and St Pancras. Camden, central London, is a kind of special kind of place. It's very like Brighton Pavilion in having a real sense of itself and a real identity and a real preparedness to be a bit different, a bit radical. And so I think it's a place where I can get elected as an MP. And particularly if you live in that seat, but even if you're around these parts, I'd really ask you to think about giving us a hand, helping here at LSE, giving us a hand out on the streets, getting involved in the campaign. Because politics is a lot of fun. I know you mightn't really believe that, but it is, really. But more than that, and what I'd say to you is, even if you're not going to do that, get involved in politics in some way or another. And by politics, I mean anything from a petition to organising something like this, getting involved. Because fundamentally, politics should be something that you do, not that's done to you. And we need to change politics. And it's in all of your hands, your generation, my generation, everybody's hands this year to really change politics and do politics. Thank you very much.